Hello, Greek students, and welcome to week 9 in our class. Congratulations to making it to this point. You have now completed an exam in the last unit, and with this week, after you've gone through this week, you will have all of the different indicative forms of Greek verbs in your tool set. They will all have been introduced to you. We're going to spend the first part of next week sort of reviewing all of those indicative forms and offering you some tips and tricks for recognizing the different forms of Greek verbs before we move on to the third declension next week. So that's all next week. But this week we have to introduce a couple more different Greek indicative forms. So first we're going to introduce the imperfect, middle, and passive. So just like the present tense, remember back to when we talked about verbs, when we first introduced verbs, we talked about the present, middle, and the present passive, and we saw that the present, middle, and the present passive have identical forms to one another. They look exactly the same, and we have to determine by the context of the sentence whether a verb is middle or whether it's passive, because they're going to look exactly the same. The same is going to be true for imperfect middle and imperfect passive, that they're going to look exactly the same, and by context we decide whether it is a middle voice verb or a passive voice verb. We're also going to introduce Aeris Middle forms. So this is going to be in the same video as the imperfect, middle, and passive forms, insofar as they're going to look the same, be built on the same endings. And then we're going to look at Aorist passive forms and future passive forms. So notice here that there are separate aorist passive forms and separate future passive forms. So that whereas the present and the imperfect have the middle and the passive in one form, the aorist and the future are going to have separate forms for the middle and the passive voice respectively. And so on the one hand, that's kind of a bummer because you have more things you have to learn, more things you have to memorize, but it's also kind of nice because it's easier to recognize a passive form in the aorist and the future. So in my opinion, the aorist and the future passives are some of the easiest forms to recognize in all of Koine Greek. So a good news, bad news sort of scenario here. So as far as what you'll be doing for memorization, is the only new thing to memorize is the secondary middle passive suffixes. And so there's going to be a quiz devoted to these along with some of the other grammar introduced for this week. But this is the only new memorization, besides of course vocabulary, that you have grammatically for this week. But I am going to ask you to re-memorize some things. And again, this is a good news, bad news scenario. You may be sort of bummed about having to go back and re-memorize things. But the good news is that if you have memorized these, if you've memorized them well and they're still sort of in your head and you can reproduce them, then you're in really, really great shape for the quiz that's going to cover these. But even if you still don't have them well in your head, hopefully that they will come back to you quickly because they were there at one point in time. So there's going to be a couple of different things that I'm going to ask you to re-memorize. And the purpose of this is sort of to recap the entirety of the Greek indicative verbal system that we'll move into a review of for next week. So memorizing or re-memorizing these things and being able to reproduce them is really going to be helpful for you in recognizing different Greek forms amidst sort of the plethora of things that have been introduced to you with respect to the indicative form. So you're going to re-memorize those primary middle passive suffixes, so sort of in conjunction with the secondary middle passive suffixes. And I'm going to give you, there's going to be a video with a slide that gives you these in a nice handy chart for you to be able to sort of reproduce and practice on your whiteboards. Then rememorize the secondary active suffixes and rememorize the primary active suffixes. And so once you see these, you'll sort of be reminded of what they are and what forms they are associated with. And remember that, and you'll see it a couple more times, that really big list of how different indicative forms are constructed. These different passive suffixes, remember, are added on to the end of the different Greek indicative forms. So knowing these well is going to really help you in your identification of different Greek verbal forms. So this is all the sort of things we have going on by way of introduction and memorization. And then by way of what we have going on for what you need to accomplish, both of the homework assignments this week are going to be translations with questions. So 5 questions in each homework assignment with some different grammatical questions associated with them. There's going to be a single vocabulary quiz, as always, and then there's going to be 2 different grammar quizzes. So the first grammar quiz is going to ask you about that new memorization of the secondary middle passive endings, or the secondary middle passive suffixes. And then the second grammar quiz is going to be a grammar review quiz that is only going to be devoted to all of the suffixes, so including the one that you're memorizing for this week. So that if you can write out all of those suffixes in the sort of chart that I'm going to give you in one of these videos, if you can write that out on your whiteboard and then be able to look at it and reproduce it when you take this grammar review quiz, you're going to be good to go, and it should be a somewhat simple task for you, and you're able to receive a grammar quiz credit, or a quiz credit for being able to do that. So I want you to think of having to go back and rememorize things not as a burden, but as as my gift to you. All I'm doing is I'm just doing you a favor here by having you recall and learn better things, but also by giving you the opportunity to get credit for the knowledge that you already have in your head, whether it's way back there or it's sort of right at the front of it. In either case, you're going to get credit for things that you already have memorized in this review quiz.